Hello and welcome to Newsclick. We have with us over telephone Mr. Ahilan Kadirgamar, spokesperson for the Sri Lanka Democracy Forum, and with whom we shall discuss the implications and reactions to the report of the UN Secretary General's panel of experts on accountability in Sri Lanka. Ahilan, welcome to Newsclick.
Thank you, Srinivasan.
Critics of both the Sri Lankan government and the LTTE, such as yourself, have for long argued about for the need for justice for the victims of the long civil war in Sri Lanka and for immediately addressing the issues concerning minorities. This seems to have been ignored by the triumphalist Sri Lankan government, if you can say so. So do you feel vindicated by the UN panel report's findings and recommendations?
Yes, the UN panel report, it's in fact a very robust report. But the first point is that this is not an investigative panel. It's only an advisory panel to the Secretary General. And in their report, they have come out with many recommendations. Chief among them is that the Sri Lankan government should carry forward investigations into alleged human rights abuses, and they believe they have credible evidence of alleged war crimes by both the Sri Lankan government and the LTT, the Sri Lankan government forces and the LTT. But they first of all want the Sri Lankan government to carry out investigations, and they believe that the UN can have a role in monitoring it. Now, as everyone knows, the last phase of the war, which this report addresses, was a very brutal phase, and estimates vary from 7,000 up to tens of thousands of people who were killed, including most of them being civilians. So they've made this very strong recommendation. Now, it's been 2 years since the end of the war, and the worry among many democracy activists inside Sri Lanka is that there hasn't been much progress at all on the issue of accountability and reconciliation. And in that context, this report is indeed very important in terms of restarting again the discussion on the need for accountability and reconciliation. And I think this is extremely important in terms of what Sri Lanka's post-war future is going to look like.
The Sri Lankan government's response, on the other hand, has been a mixture of denial and outrage at the attempts by the UN to impinge on what it calls its sovereignty, right? So in a sense, the reaction is also quite tragic.
Now, this sovereignty argument I think has many sides to it. On the one hand, it is true that historically, third world sovereignty and the sovereignty of small states like Sri Lanka do get interfered with by larger powers. There's no question about that. And as many actors inside Sri Lanka argue, it'll be much harder for the Secretary General, for example, to have a similar panel on Iraq or Afghanistan. On the other hand, what does this sovereignty really mean to the people of Sri Lanka? Or is it only about defending a regime and consolidating the power of the Rajapaksa regime? I think that is the important question here. And unfortunately, I think not only in Sri Lanka, in many states over the last few decades, particularly after the end of the Bandung era, third world sovereignty and national security have been arguments that have been used to strengthen or entrench repressive regimes. Now, the External Affairs Minister G.L. Pires went so far as to say that the UN panel report should not be published, that it would in fact strengthen extremists inside the country, that it would open up wounds that have started to heal. These have been the arguments of the Sri Lankan government. But I would argue that it is actually the Sri Lankan government that has been giving center stage to singular nationalists. They have been whipping up both xenophobia, jingoism, and nationalist sentiments inside the country. While they condemn the West for interfering with their sovereignty, they use often the very same language that the Bush regime used of the war on terror, and phrases like, if you're not with us, you're against us. That sort of mentality also continues in Sri Lanka. And while mentioning this argument of sovereignty, Sri Lanka in the last 3 years has been floating a number of sovereign bonds. It's ironic, but when it comes to the economic front, the last budget, for example, much of it has been about opening up Sri Lanka's financial markets to global capital. So there are contradictions in the way in which they are using this sovereignty argument.
So at one level, within domestically, the Sri Lankan government or the regime is trying to whip up nationalism to paper over concerns about what it did during the civil war, and externally it seems that the Sri Lankan government is using geopolitics, diplomacy to curry support for its position vis-a-vis the UN. Recently, GL Paris has been going around to. He has been to Delhi. He has been to Beijing. What do you make of the Indian government and the Chinese government response to these diplomatic moves?
Within Sri Lanka, whipping up nationalism has been very helpful for the current government and the consolidation of the regime. Militarization and the consolidation of power domestically has worked along with this kind of reaction to the UN panel. Now, externally, I think the Sri Lankan government is worried. The Human Rights Council sessions may bring this up in the near future. So they're concerned about that this will be brought up in international fora. And in that context, External Affairs Minister GL Paris was in India 2 weeks ago. The May 17th joint statement is quite revealing. And here, when it comes to India, at least from the joint statement, and certainly there's been very strong reactions inside Sri Lanka to it. It seems like there might be some kind of shift in India's engagement with Sri Lanka. In the joint statement, issues such as the lack of movement in terms of the political process and devolution have been brought up. There have also been calls on Sri Lanka to end the state of emergency, to move on genuine reconciliation, and address the concerns of the displaced and resettlement. And the Sri Lankan government strategy over the last few years has been to balance India with engagement with China. So soon after the External Affairs Minister's visit to India, he was in China, and China actually has been much more vocal in saying that Sri Lanka can address its own problems, and there is no need for a UN role. Now, both I think in the near term, both India's role and China's role are going to be significant in terms of how the UN's role develops in Sri Lanka. In fact, within 2 weeks after the end of the war, there were two important developments back in May, June 2009. One, the UN Secretary General visited Sri Lanka a few days after the end of the war and came out with a joint statement with the President, from which he draws his mandate, because in that joint statement, the Secretary General, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and President Rajapaksa said that Sri Lanka will address concerns of accountability and reconciliation, and lack of movement on that was the Secretary General's. He used that point to initiate this particular advisory panel. The second important thing within weeks after the end of the war was a UN Human Rights Council resolution. While the European Union and other countries wanted a resolution that condemned the conduct of Sri Lanka's approach to the war, many of the Asian powers, including India and China, turned that resolution more or less into one congratulating Sri Lanka on ending the war. And one of the recommendations of this panel of advisors, the UN panel report, is that the UN Human Rights Council should reconsider that resolution. And I think that's of serious concern to Sri Lanka. And in that context, I think there will be a lot of diplomatic moves made. There have already been a number of moves made, and possibly in the near future.
Right. Let's turn our attention towards the Tamil diaspora. The sections of the Tamil diaspora have always maintained that actions during the last phase of the civil war were close to or even should be defined as genocide. Now, while they have reacted with some amount of fervor to the UN's panel report on what they claim to be actions by the Lankan armed forces, they have been conspicuously silent on the actions by the LTT themselves, right? So, things like LTT using the Tamil people as human shields, illegally conscripting them, making them dig trenches and so on and so forth. So, has the diaspora learnt its lessons at all following the defeat of the LTT?
Yeah, no, the role of the diaspora, and the diaspora is not monolithic. There are, of course, different sections within the diaspora, but the most mobilized sections of the diaspora has been very problematic. Over the last 25 years, they gave unconditional support to the LTT. And on the other hand, the LTT also used intimidation to control the diaspora. They worked more or less like a mafia in controlling large sections of the diaspora, forcefully also collecting funds for their war chest. And so these mobilized sections of the diaspora have used the word genocide to describe what's going on in Sri Lanka. I would actually disagree with that characterization. There may have been war crimes that might have been committed, but it's not a genocide, because in Sri Lanka we have a long history of strong inter-ethnic relations. The Sinhala and Tamil community, as well as the Muslim community, which is rarely talked of outside, have lived side by side. Now, the war did to some extent polarize these communities, and that's why there needs to be a process of reconciliation. But what happened was not genocide, and the UN panel report is also careful not to use the language of genocide, because I think there is a possibility of a future where all these communities can live together, and we have to be very careful of the language that we use to describe the situation in Sri Lanka. Now, towards the end of the war, it was a very brutal end, as we all know, and severe human rights abuses were committed by both parties to the war, both the Sri Lankan government as well as the LTT. And some would argue that the LTT should take even more responsibility, because they more or less held this large population, a population close to 300,000 people, hostage as human shields. People who tried to flee were shot by the LTT. So a number of people were killed, and the LTT really took the Tamil community on a suicidal path. And unfortunately, even now, that introspection, that critical reflection, is not happening adequately within the larger diaspora. Though with the end of the LTT, space is starting to open up. The diasporic forces are starting to fracture. I think more democratically minded forces are starting to emerge. And I think the younger generation is also beginning to change. So these are positive developments, but I think it's going to take time. You know, the unfortunate thing in terms of the reaction to the UN panel report is, and I always say that the Sinhala nationalists and the Tamil nationalists, whether they be inside the country or in the diaspora, they are objective allies. They need each other to reinforce each other. And they have been saying the same thing with respect to the UN panel report. The Sinhala nationalists and even the government to some extent claims that this UN panel report has been lobbied by, it's a creation of the pro-LTT sections of the diaspora, which is obviously not true, because the UN panel report is extremely critical of the LTT, but they never highlight that. The Sri Lankan government never highlights the fact that the UN panel report has been very critical of the LTT. On the other hand, the pro-LTT sections of the diaspora have also been silent about the LTT's abuses, its war crimes committed that are alleged in this particular report. So I think there needs to be serious critical reflection broadly in the diaspora, and that the broader diaspora should not play a negative role any longer in terms of reconciliation and a different future in Sri Lanka.